Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Oh, what a week. Tonight will be all about impeachment, and we also will make you a big part of our program. I know you've heard varying accounts from Republicans and Democrats about what's at stake right now, but at the end of the day, this is about what you, the public, will convey to your lawmakers as to how serious you believe both the allegations and the evidence is against one Donald J. Trump. Toll-free number right there on your screen, 888-766-2428. And I ask you tonight, have these hearings, both last week and this week on impeachment, changed your mind? Where do you stand right now as Congress prepares to head home? We're going to get to those calls coming up in the program. You, a big part of our show. In a few minutes, a former Watergate prosecutor, he'll join us and he'll explain why he says President Trump deserves to be impeached on the evidence already presented. But first, we want to reset this impeachment inquiry, and a lot of information has been thrown at all of us, and want to show you where we stand right now. Now, over the past 2 weeks, we have heard from 12 witnesses over the course of 7 hearings. They provided various levels of detail about the quid pro quo with Ukraine and President Trump's involvement in it. But the most damaging testimony, I think without question, came from Gordon Sondland. He, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union. Sondland, he's a wealthy hotel owner from Oregon, and he's a big donor to the GOP and, at the end of the day, to Trump's inauguration. In fact, he wrote a $1 million check. He has no diplomatic experience, but that didn't stop the president from appointing him and then making him his point man when it came to Ukraine, even though, curiously, he had no background in it and it really wasn't his portfolio. Take a listen to Mr. Sondland just yesterday.
Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I worked with Mr. Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine matters at the express direction of the President of the United States. Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election DNC server and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President. Everyone was in the loop.
Okay, so you got that? The president's point guy in Ukraine says quid pro quo. Everybody in the loop here. This was at the president's direction. We're doing what Trump wanted. I don't know how vague or unclear that was, but apparently President Trump, he was watching a different hearing than the rest of us, because this is his takeaway after he saw Sondland's testimony.
I say to the ambassador in response, I want nothing, I want nothing, I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky, President Zelensky, to do the right thing. So here's my answer. I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. Then he says, this is the final word from the President of the United States.
Sounds like Trump. He doesn't want anything in return. Trump, not exactly known for his honesty, not going on a limb there, but his acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, as we know, got himself into trouble for actually telling the truth.
You just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happened as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
That wasn't some cobbled together clip here. That was on live television in a press conference. The chief of staff of the president admitting there was a quid pro quo. Now, a lot of Trump supporters apparently were like the president, and apparently a lot of folks on the Hill on the GOP side, that they were unmoved by the testimony of Sondland. Politico spells it all out in a piece where the headline says it all. Republicans on the Sondland impeachment bombshells. Who cares? Now, I'm going to quote from 2 Republicans that are mentioned in this piece, 2 senators definitely on the right side of the party, but nonetheless, senators nonetheless. Senator Mike Braun of Indiana, There have been several folks that have testified that they think that it was not only inappropriate, but there was a quid pro quo. And I'm going to base it upon not someone's opinion, but what I actually see. So far, that's the transcript for me. Okay, Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa, obviously head of the Judiciary Committee, he says, what difference does it make? What difference does it make? This is all out in the public with the summary the president put out 2 or 3 months ago. It doesn't make any difference what anybody else said. Grassley going to take the word of the president. That's good enough for him. I'm going to bring in our senior political correspondent right now, Andrew Whitman, and he's going to show you the case the Democrats have not only been laying out here, but the corroborating testimony seems to support, and how it clearly shows the president was involved, there was a quid pro quo, and all the disinformation that's been coming from the other side here in the intervening days. Andrew?
And Rich, one of the key ways to do that, one of the key elements to show that, is by comparing some specific dates to specific events. So I'm going to begin by quickly running through a timeline of some key events in the Ukraine mess. Let's go back to July 10th. Then National Security Advisor John Bolton stormed out of a meeting with Ukrainian officials and said he didn't want to be involved in this drug deal. Gordon Sondland was also there, and that's where witnesses say Sondland explicitly spelled out the quid pro quo. A week later, the White House Budget Office announced that aid to Ukraine was being held up. That was internal. Then on July 25th, the infamous call with President Trump and the Ukrainian president, where Trump asked for a favor. 2 weeks later, on August 12th, the whistleblower filed his complaint, and that's when the scandal really began to blow up. August 28th, Politico reports aid to Ukraine is being held up. It goes public. September 9th, word of the whistleblower complaint goes to Congress and goes public. 2 days after that, September 11th, the White House reverses course and releases aid to Ukraine. Shortly after that, Speaker Pelosi announces the impeachment inquiry. A day after that, the White House releases the call transcript, which brings us to the public hearings. But before I move on, I want to reinforce one point. The aid to Ukraine wasn't actually released until after the whistleblower complaint became front page news, as did news that Ukraine aid was being withheld. And that's also when the impeachment buzz began to gain traction. Plus, the Ukrainians knew something was wrong even before that infamous July 25th call. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Laura Cooper testified to that fact yesterday.
My staff showed me 2 unclassified emails that they received from the State Department. One was received on July 25th at 2:31 p.m. That email said that the Ukrainian Embassy and House Foreign Affairs Committee are asking about security assistance. The second email was received on July 25th at 4:25 p.m. That email said that the Hill knows about the FMF situation to an extent, and so does the Ukrainian Embassy.
They're reaching out to her on the day of the phone call, saying that Ukraine is aware of it and asking questions about it they must have known before the call. An acting ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, provided even more details about the quid pro quo and about Sondland when he testified last week.
This was the first time that I had heard that the security assistance, not just the White House meeting, was conditioned on the investigations. Very concerned, on that same day, September 1st, I sent Ambassador Sondland a text message asking if we are now saying that the security assistance and a White House meeting are conditioned on investigations. Ambassador Sondland responded asking me to call him, which I did. During that phone call, Ambassador Sondland told me that President Trump had told him that he wants President Zelensky to state publicly that Ukraine will investigate Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. Ambassador Sondland also told me that he now recognized that he had made a mistake by earlier telling Ukrainian officials that only a White House meeting with President Zelensky was dependent on a public announcement of the investigations. In fact, Ambassador Sondland said everything was dependent on such an announcement, including security assistance.
And Gordon Sondland confirmed that quid pro quo additionally in his testimony yesterday. Now, bear in mind, Taylor, who you just heard from, isn't a partisan in anyone's eyes. He's a diplomat that had to deal with people like Sondland and Giuliani because the president thrust those guys upon him. We'll finish up with Fiona Hill's testimony earlier today. The former member of the National Security Council admonished Republicans, but not by name, for spreading misinformation.
Right now, Russia's security services and their proxies have geared up to repeat their interference in the 2020 election. We are running out of time to stop them. In the course of this investigation, I would ask that you please not promote politically driven falsehoods that so clearly advance Russian interests.
Rich?
It's been a very long week, but it's been a very interesting week. We're going to be talking to a former prosecutor in a minute. Then we're going to be bringing in our audience. I'm really curious their take on it, because we've watched every frame of this going back to last week through the entirety of it. And again, tonight, folks, if you missed some of the testimony, I know a lot of people caught at work, but from 7 to 9, we're going to air for you the most important bites that we thought that you might have missed today from the testimony of both the witnesses and also a lot of the lawmakers. And you're going to get a real sense as to who wanted to find answers, who wanted to avoid questions, and politically where people are right now. And there's also some reporting that we'll get into that the Senate fully expects that the articles of impeachment are going to come out of the House when there turns out to be a full floor vote. And they will not dismiss this when it gets to the Senate because they don't believe there's the votes. There's not enough Republicans that are willing to say we want to dismiss this outright. There's going to be a trial. Now, the form of the trial and everything we'll get into with the counselor. But, Andrew, at the end of the process, and you laid out the timeline, we've heard from the witnesses, I think almost without exception, the most impressive thing out of this whole thing has been the witnesses. These are people we should feel, all of us, whoever you voted for, comfortable that are the front-facing voices for America on the front lines.
Want more of them.
Oh my God, they're all professional. They didn't come across as partisan folks. The one clown you could argue was Sondland. He had the most devastating testimony. To that end, how dismayed or otherwise were you at the conclusion of the hearings that we know what happened and that there is a will to do the right thing in Washington?
I feel pretty confident that we know what happened just because of the number of witnesses whose testimony overlapped in terms of the confirmations that we had. In terms of the politics of it all, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but just listening to the testimony, just like the rest of the American public, that was my takeaway. I came to this conclusion as I was thinking about it. Democrats went down this road towards impeachment despite their reservations. Through the entire time the Mueller process was going on and when Mueller was testifying and after the report came out, there were a lot of Democrats, a lot of people who wanted the impeachment process to start, and the Democrats were like, I don't know. This is because there's political danger in doing so. But when the Ukraine story broke, the conclusion was the danger is of lesser consideration. We have to do our constitutional duty.
The danger is if we don't do anything,
and
right.
go through this process. The Republican Party en masse is about to fail a huge civics test, one of the biggest I can think of. They've shown no intellectual interest or curiosity in getting to the bottom of the story. All they've done is circle their wagons around President Trump. They have been okay with the blockade of witnesses and information that might allow the truth to come out. If they are so insistent that this president did nothing wrong, then emptying the cans of all the evidence should lead to that conclusion. And
I'll push back
to do
even
it.
on that, because to me, there's one thing with wanting transparency and one thing with that, but they didn't even go through the pretense. They didn't go through the motions. Not one of them. There was a scintilla or sliver this afternoon with Congressman Hurd from Texas where he said, I heard some troubling things in effect today. But that was, to give you an idea, that was it. Not one question was asked by any Republican for over a double-digit witnesses to try to extract fact, to have an informed opinion as to whether or not a high crime and a misdemeanor occurred. Now, my only point is, with Bill Clinton, there were a lot of Democrats. And by the way, as an American, I had big problems with what Bill Clinton did too. There were questions asked. People wanted to learn what happened. In the end, people largely fell along, party lines. But at least there was a fact-finding in the beginning to it. Now, there's no perfect process, and I know there's always going to be partisans. But to me, it was shameful what Devin Nunes did. Yeah, I think he embarrassed himself in the process, but apparently he had an audience of one, and he passed the test. But we're worse off for it. I still think, like Andrew did, we clearly got to the bottom. There was a quid pro quo. You have to live in a make-believe land of unbelievable naivete to believe this president, after the 3 years you've learned of him as president, and even a candidate before in a lifetime of transactional action leading to this moment, that he did not hold up aid and cancel meetings on a precondition he wanted something. And since when does this incurious man ever be invested, I mean, think of the farce of what I'm about to say, in foreign internal corruption? You really think Donald Trump cares about corruption in a foreign land? Please. And one specific company that just so happened to have a tie to his possible, if not probable, general election opponent. Okay, so let's suspend disbelief here. We all know he cared about that. But he used our money, our $400 million that was appropriated by Congress, to help an ally who was staring at the Russians, who had already killed more than 10,000 Ukrainians and had already invaded and annexed Crimea. They're looking across the border at the Russians. We held up our aid and held up our legitimization of this new government with Zelensky on a condition. Now, who did the rocket scientist decide to employ to be his front man? None other than Rudy Giuliani, who none of you would trust to defend you in a parking ticket case, but yet he's our guy. He pulls our ambassadors who've been embedded there, who, by the way, Secretary of State Pompeo, who has shown unbelievable cowardice in standing up for his own State Department, by the way, including Yovanovitch and other people who were smeared and even removed in this process, but I digress. So the proper front-facing people, Ambassador Taylor and the rest, were moved out. And in its place is Garrett Sundlin, a hotelier from Oregon, because he wrote $1 million check and the president knew he could co-opt him. He's going over there and he said, hey, you got to go in front of the cameras. I want a press conference with CNN. Doesn't really matter if you do anything about your investigation, but you got to announce the investigation, talk about Burisma, and mention Hunter Biden. You do that, you'll get the money. You do that, we'll even have a meeting with the vice president or the president. You can come to the Oval. Then, after all that goes down, and by the way, the biggest story out of this might be who's in this food chain. It's not just Rudy, it's not just the Donald, and it's not just Sundlin. We learn out that the chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney's in this. We learn after that Secretary of State Pompeo is invested in this. Secretary Perry from Energy, and I go on. They're all in the loop. They all know. But do we have any legitimate questions out of that? Do we have any shock and awe coming from the other side? No. So now we have a political test that comes. Where do we go next from here? We're going to talk about the process. I'm going to get your reaction to what we've heard to this point. Have we reached the standard where you believe our commander-in-chief has committed a high crime and a misdemeanor? Got a lot of questions for our next guest coming up here, former federal prosecutor. He's going to put this in context to Watergate, to today, all that and much more straight ahead.